All right, so we'll go ahead and I'll let people in. I'll give a little introduction um, of the store and you, and then
Please.
all right, and we're recording. And all right, welcome everybody to the next in our series, our Meet the Author series. Tonight we have Irene Drago from Maine. Her two books are Daughters of Longreach, and her latest novel is The MAINE POINT. She's the winner of the Bath Maine Spirit Award. In 2018, she won the Next Generation Indie Book Award for the best first novel. And she's worked for, in the past, she's worked for the Defense Department. She has a master's in arts and Spanish language and literature, and she's taught high school and college. I want to just make a quick note that I'm going to have everybody keep your mics, microphones, and videos off. And if you wish to ask a question or have a comment for Irene, use the chat feature and I will relay it to her. For those watching on Facebook Live, same thing, use the comment section of the Facebook and I will relay your question and or comment. Irene, welcome to a Freethinkers Corner Meet the Author Zoom event.
Hi, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining me. As Chris already stated, my name is Irene Drago, the author of Daughters of Longreach and The MAINE POINT, and I'm delighted to be at a Freethinkers Corner in Dover, New Hampshire, virtually. I'm especially pleased because I think I was in the first wave of indie authors to visit Freethinkers Corner way back in March of 2018 when you could sign books in person, and Chris had only recently opened up the shop. I live in Bath, Maine, the mid-coast, but I have a strong connection to Dover. My husband's grandfather used to have his podiatry practice right across the street and a couple of blocks down on Central Avenue in a big old house. And next door, they now have a Rite Aid. But that, if you are from Dover, you can spot his grandfather's home. And we used to go down that street very slowly and show the kids. It was years after he had passed. So that's my connection to Dover. And I'm delighted to be here. And I want to thank Chris Upton and a Freethinkers Corner for giving this opportunity to authors to be able to talk about their books during this unusual time. So I like to begin with just the 2-minute elevator overview. We call it the elevator speech, in case you haven't read The MAINE POINT. And let's begin there. The MAINE POINT is a seafaring family love story, and it is spanning 4 generations from 1936 to 2020. It's the tale of 3 Roses: Mary Rose, Stella Rose, and Anna Rose. These 3 very courageous, beautiful women illuminate how Maine tides can bring a family home. And home is a synonym for love, especially for families that go to sea or send loved ones to sea. This is historical fiction with a contemporary romantic twist. It continues the story of Daughters of Longreach, and there is a past and a present storyline, and the magic happens when the 2 storylines intersect. I weave them together in both novels, chapter by chapter. So I've prepared a PowerPoint really just to give you some visuals to go by. I don't know if Chris mentioned, but I think he did. After I was a Russian analyst for one of those lovely intelligence communities that keep us all safe, I was a teacher, and you're going to see that the way I write fiction is influenced by my years in the classroom. So I like to state the goal before we even get to the visual aids here. I have 2 goals tonight. One, to share with you why I write historical fiction. And the second, how I do it. So that's what I will thread through my entire presentation tonight. This first shot, Maine's history is naturally romantic. If you take a peek and you're familiar at all with Maine, and there's so many rivers. This is the Cathance River in Bodenham. And I took this picture just a couple of months ago because Bodenham happens to be next door to a really lovely apple orchard where I go every year to pick apples. And I just got here late in the afternoon and was struck by the fact that I had described Bodenham in Daughters of Longreach. So just to connect this main point emphasis to daughters, the Mary Rose character that I mentioned actually was born in Bodenham at her father's farm, and her father was a sea captain, actually the longest employed sea captain for a big shipyard here in Bath. Now I changed all the names, but since you're joining me tonight, the McGowan name was really Mac in real life, and Mary Rose was Marie Mac, the daughter of Captain Robert Mac. And Mary Rose actually lived in my house for a little bit. It's quite a story. So if you read Daughters of Longreach and you get to that character, you'll see what happens. And Mary Rose continues into the second book. So that's why we begin with Bodenham. And also this quote, as soon as histories are properly told, there is no need of romances. That was Walt Whitman, one of my favorite American poets. And a critic who read Daughters of Longreach actually used that quote and said, but Bath author Irene Drago may prove him wrong. And I just loved it. It really speaks to the fact of why I don't write nonfiction. I think that history is emotional because it has an impact on everyone's life. And I believe when you write fiction, you have the freedom to explore the emotions more than when you're doing a factual account, fact by fact. And getting back to that teaching arena, I found that history is easier to remember if you attach a story to it. And I feel it is so important to remember history that I want to attach a really good story so that the history stands out. And really, every historical fiction novel has a big story and a little story. In my main point, the big history, the big story is the Depression, the crash of '29 and the years that follow, and World War II, which ultimately brought us out of that depression. But when you look at it, neither event was a very positive one, and yet so many did survive. That's why we're all here. And that's a big part of the seed of this story, the big story. The little story is how a family from Bath survived. So 2 novels, Daughters of Longreach and The Main Point. If you look at Daughters of Longreach, you see an image, an artistic rendering of the Kennebec River. And that's really why I started writing this series about seafaring families. I come from a Navy family, so there was a natural attraction. But I bought an old house in Bath, Maine, right along the Kennebec here. And when I did the house history, I found that not one, but multiple sea captains and shipbuilders lived in my home. And when I investigated further, their stories were so amazing. Literally, they were like the astronauts of the 19th century going around Cape Horn, which was just a treacherous, treacherous voyage. They were so brave, so bold, and really so worldly because of their travels. I just had to tell the story. And when you come from a Navy family, you're brought up hearing sea stories. So I think I was prepared for this challenge. If you notice, my tagline on my cover is "Maine tides bring a family home." And the more I wrote, the more I felt that home was a central theme for me, a Navy family. We tend to romanticize home. Distance makes the heart grow fonder, right? So that's where we began, and that actually began in 1854. So if you put my 2 novels together, I'm really spanning 160 years of maritime history, American maritime history. And in The Main Point, you see Marshall Point. And that is a very storied place. If you like Forrest Gump, when Tom Hanks runs across the country, he ends up in the Northeast in Maine at a lighthouse, and that lighthouse was Marshall Point. And I actually write about that connection. I'm all about connection. So you'll see the roses, the beach roses, right there in the foreground. And that's where it all begins, the cover. The cover artist is Claudette Gamache, a dear friend of mine. And when she painted Daughters of Longreach, she was renting the Sewell's Shipyard office, which is just behind my house, down the little hill, right on the Kennebec River. So she was in the office where my character, Uncle Arthur, changing the name to Gannett in Daughters of Longreach, worked. And if you go into that, what now is a cottage, there's a wall of cubby holes. And that's where they kept all of the architectural prints for the ships, and their names like Shenandoah, Susquehanna, Drago, Iroquois, they're all in beautiful calligraphy, gold calligraphy on every little cubby door. And that's where she painted it. And then she painted the main point to be very complimentary of the first cover. So I begin my novel, The Main Point, with an arrival, a coming home. And it is the Portland headlight because Anna Rose Malone, is flying into the Portland jetport. And if you see the roses here, those are the main Rosa rugosas. It's just, actually, each chapter that's in the past starts with that little rose. So I wanted to just read a little bit of that arrival for Anna Malone, the present day storyline. So this will be 2018. On its final approach, American Airlines Flight 732 glided over Maine's Casco Bay like an osprey in flight. From my seat, I could see the wake of a ferry, and as the plane bank left, I spied 2 islands dotting the bay. The captain was clearly piloting our plane between those islands as we prepared to land at Portland International Jetport. Peering out the window, I took a deep breath and focused on Portland headlight. I imagined all the storms it had survived, all the keepers it had protected, and all the sailors its light had saved. Since I'm a screenwriter, I'm always looking for a touchstone, and a lighthouse usually has a secret to tell. Characters were emerging, a storyline was forming, and words were beginning to appear on a blank page in my mind when a commanding voice interrupted my creative flow. Sir, please turn off all your electronic devices and stow your briefcase below the seat in front of you. I didn't hear an apology, but I did hear a click when the man behind me closed his laptop. I folded my hands in my lap, closed my eyes, and wondered why there was always at least one very important person on every flight. Then I took a cleansing breath. Maybe 4 months was too long to be away from Bath, away from Jake. How long could a bicoastal love survive? My eyes blinked open as the plane touched down with a bump. I looked through the window to confirm that we were taxiing at PWM after that hard landing. When I saw the 2-story terminal against the topaz-colored sky, I sighed. Maine looked fresh and clean, so different from LA and New York, and it felt good to be home. I stood up to open the overhead compartment and thought of Jake waiting for me, running his hands through his hair, stretching, and checking his phone for updates. That happy thought made me smile, but it didn't give me the strength to free my bag. As I tugged on it for the 3rd time, I heard a magnetic voice say, "Can I help you with that?" "No thanks, I've got it," I replied with feigned hubris. Just as I was about to lose my balance and let the bag come crashing down, the gentleman with the voice reached above my head and caught it. I glanced at the handsome older man and blushed. "Thank you, I guess I'm not that strong after all." So clearly, I write historical romance, and I embrace the romance. The older man is going to become a character in the story, a key character, and there's a lot of romance. So some people say Daughters of Longreach was heavy on the history and lighter on the romance, and they think The Main Point is a little lighter on the history and a little heavier on the romance. But the fact is, the history is accurate. The ships and travel and events that shape the lives of these characters that are developing through the storylines are accurate. But the romance is entertaining and it keeps us paying attention and sharpens us. And I think that we teach history by war. We start with the Revolutionary War, we go to the War of 1812 and the Civil War and the Spanish-American War and World War I, and World War II and the Korean conflict and Vietnam and Desert Storm and Afghanistan. But throughout history, throughout all that war, there is love. A really wonderful novel I read was titled just that, Love and War. And then of course there's Tolstoy, War and Peace. So bear in mind, I was a Russian analyst, so I studied both Russian and Spanish, literature and language, and I like to have lots of characters. And if you have past and present storylines, you have a lot going on. But after years of teaching, I map it out so that there's no trouble following what's going on. And the twist is always how the present connects with the past. And it's through that connection that we learn that history is, not was. We are a product of what has happened in our lives, in our families' lives, in our country's lives, in the world history. We're impacted. And the romance just flows from that. So interestingly enough, to show you how I put this together, I did research, when should I start this novel? And 1936 just jumped off the history pages. In 1936, the W.T. Grant department store opened in Bath on the corner of Water and Center Street. And this is the building today that you're looking at. And what's really interesting to me is that I never noticed that the name of the building, which is very hard to see after all the wear. It was new in 1936, by the way. This is not one of those 19th century buildings in Bath because they tore down the original city hall that was in this location when they built a big memorial to Davenport, and that became the city hall. This building went up, and in 1936, it opened in the fall, and I have chapter 2 begin with a new character to my series, Penny. And Penny starts work here for the holiday season as a sales clerk. And the store had just opened in the mid-fall. So it's been a month, barely a month, and works in this building. Now, it went on to be a Sears and Roebuck and then became a very popular local craft store called Tate's for years. And that store closed just as I arrived in Bath. 2013 I came. By 2017, the store was empty, and it has been empty. So Bath, talk about how the present connects to the past, decided to join forces with BIW, Bath Iron Works, and the city, and make it a safe gathering, not gathering space, I shouldn't use that, a safe space for winter shelter. If you needed some Wi-Fi, a coffee break, you got lunch, takeout, and you worked in the area, maybe worked at BIW, you could come in here with social distancing. And it opened just last week. They had the ribbon cutting. And BIW helped fund it, and they definitely wanted a nautical theme. So Beacon Park sounds like Beacon of Hope, sounds like a lighthouse bringing people home. And hopefully it's going to help us weather the storm. Someone has bought the building and something new is going in after COVID. But look at that title right up there when you see the grant, and then look at the Film Center building and the interior. That's Art Deco. And I decided to open with the opening of the W.T. Grant store in 1936. And as I drove along into the novel, I wanted Penny to move to New York and meet up with her cousin. And they went to work at the Film Center building in Midtown Manhattan, a neighborhood that's called Hell's Kitchen, but really in the 1930s was very lovely. That building, as you saw, is still there. And that's Art Deco too. So Grant building, still see it, fancy, is part of that Art Deco movement in the 30s. I'm only going to do 3 little readings, but I wanted you to get a sense of this building in 1936. December. Penelope Solis McGowan, known by everyone in Bath as Penny, tucked her white blouse into her navy blue skirt for the 3rd time since arriving at the W.T. Grant department store on the corner of Water and Center Streets. She was trying not to bite her freshly polished nails. Her aunt, Mary Rose Goss, had told her that the first day would be the hardest. Working and waiting at the cosmetics counter, she applied some red lipstick and recalled her aunt's advice. Be patient with every customer, including the difficult ones, and be brave. Only the brave survive working in a retail shop. She looked into the mirror and her brown eyes looked back with exuberance. In that moment, she remembered what her aunt had said at the kitchen door. I believe in you, Penny. My family is my best work, and I know you can achieve whatever your heart wishes. Miss McGowan, the manager shouted. Yes, Mr. Harris, Penny responded. Augie Harris leaned over the counter until his large, veiny red nose was a mere 6 inches from Penny's face. Don't forget to stock aisle 4 with long red tapers. It's December after all, and customers buy candles in December. They'll be looking for red ones. Penny could smell the alcohol on his breath, even though it was early in the day. Biting her lip, she stepped back. She wondered how anyone could sound so annoyed on such a beautiful winter morning. Christmas was only a few weeks away, and she wanted to be merry, but staring into Mr. Harris's bloodshot eyes, she began to doubt the Daily Times morning headline. Glimmers of hope appear in Bath. Since the crash of 29, families along the Kennebec had been struggling to keep their heads above water. Then the river flooded, and they thought they were literally going to drown. She almost laughed when she realized her mind was creating a metaphor out of 2 disasters. For generations, Kennebeckers, like her father, had sailed down the river to the ocean. But last March, during the spring thaw, families feared they would lose their homes and businesses when the rain was torrential and ice jams even threatened the bridges. The ice field moved southward toward the sea, carrying with it all sorts of debris, a coal shed, a dead cow, a shanty, and parts of the Richmond-Dresden Bridge. Tasked with breaking up the ice field, the Coast Guard cutter Ossipee positioned herself north of the Carleton Bridge. Everyone in the city held their breaths while they waited to see if the 9-year-old bridge would survive the force of the moving ice. By the grace of God and the skill of the Coast Guard, the bridge remained standing. When the rain finally stopped, Bath celebrated. On March 25, 1936, Bath Iron Works launched its new destroyer, the USS Drayton, and the skies over Bath began to clear. For some indiscernible reason, remembering the history of the Kennebec emboldened Penny. Stepping up to the counter, she chose to be brave and not let Mr. Harris dampen her spirit. This part is a section I read and I wanted to illustrate because, unbeknownst to me, the launching of the USS Drayton in March of 1936 was going to play a big role in the survival of my family. And I'm not sure I'd be here if it wasn't for the USS Drayton. So my illustrator, who painted in pastel, Daughters of Longreach and the MAINE Point, said to me when she came over to get a feel for how she should paint my cover, I was telling her at that point I knew the connection between the Drayton and my family, and she said, there are just some forces. There are forces that move us. And I feel that when you write historical fiction, your research leads you to things that you should know and have to tell. And that's how I feel about the MAINE Point. And I think I'll wait before I tell you. But by the end of this presentation, you're going to see some other photos that will link the present and the past. So the Film Center building is part of the beginning of my story. My story has 3 parts. Sometimes people call me the random thought generator, but when it comes to writing, I have a natural sense of organization, I think. And there are 3 parts and 2 storylines, and 3 parts in the present and 3 parts in the past. And that first part brings Penny to New York City in the past storyline. And the Film Center building is key. It is the home to the National Screen Service. And there it is, present day. And here's a picture of the National Screen Service trailers sell seats. And I found this picture folded, and you can see the folds, and it's from the 1930s when I moved to Bath. You know how treasures get lost and treasures get discovered when you move, and Navy people move a lot. And I know this for a fact. And I was unpacking boxes and found this photo, and it connected me to my Aunt Estelle and my Uncle Bill. And my Uncle Bill is the gentleman, if you're looking at the screen, in the left corner. And he is sitting cross legs as if he's at a campfire. And he's wearing a tie and a suit. Oh, wait a minute. They all are. And they're all men. This is a little bit like the Mad Men, definitely. All salesmen, all in suits. And they're actually from all over the country. This was a convention they had in New York City. My Uncle Bill was assigned the New England Territory, which included Maine. And the National Screen Service became a monopoly, actually. It's in the law books. It lasted in one form or another into the 70s. They made the trailers and the posters for new movies. And these gentlemen would travel to movie theaters all over and sell the trailer and the poster, and then of course the movie would sell too. So it was a wonderful New York Hollywood connection, but the gentlemen were all over the country. And this picture and the following really inspired a storyline. My Aunt Estelle worked at National Screen Service as a receptionist. She was a teenager. And my Uncle Bill at that time was 8 years older, very dashing, as he appears here. I don't know what your background is, but obviously I love the movies. If you read my novels, you know that. And I always think my Uncle Bill reminded me a little bit of the actor Ben Johnson, who worked a lot with John Wayne in Westerns and pictures like that. But Uncle Bill was just charming. And they fell in love and got married. And Aunt Estelle had lots of stories to tell. So they went to Old Orchard Beach, Maine. And I didn't know I would ever live in Maine at that time. I'm not a Mainer. I was born in the shadow of the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And so when I found this and saw Old Orchard Beach, it's really made of leather. It's a souvenir, 1934. Estelle and Bill, it's burned into the leather. And I was like, wow. So I opened the book, and it was with that National Screen Service. And I remembered my aunt telling stories about how she was very young and everyone was older. And a lot of the Hollywood stars would wrap a movie in Hollywood and then go to Maine to relax, be far away from the cameras and the newspapermen. Paparazzi wasn't a term, but that you get the idea. And Betty Davis was there. She was an older woman, older at that time than my aunt. And she was quite attracted to my uncle and apparently really tried hard. And he resisted and did not indulge her. And that was a story they told over and over again. So when I saw the picture on the right, I looked and thought, is that Don Amici? Because I watch a lot of old movies, and that would be my Aunt Estelle in the middle. And my gallery view is blocking, but you should be able to see what would be Don Amici's wife, Honore. And so I did some research, and I'm not 100% sure, and my aunt and all of my mom's family really of that generation has passed. I can't be sure. But what I did find out was that Don Amici made two movies in 1939. One was The Three Musketeers, and the other, The Story of Alexander Graham Bell. And I actually talk about this Hollywood, Maine connection and Old Orchard Beach in particular. Now, the fact that he played one of the Three Musketeers, I think actually escaped me when I got to the end of my novel, I didn't really write about it. I think it might have been in the back of my mind. But if you see later on, or if you have a copy of my book, I do have a quote, two quotes from Alexandre Dumas, and we'll see one of them later. And they're very significant. And one is directly from the Three Musketeers. So I dedicated this book to my mom and her three sisters. They were the Four Musketeers. So that's a big part of the storyline as well. And we're weaving present and past, so I wanted my slides to go that way. This is Marshall Point. As it looks today, I actually took these photos, I think, when I just began to think of this novel. I mentioned that Tom Hanks shot the end of the movie Forrest Gump here, and the seed for the present storyline actually started up in Rockland at the Lobster Fest. I was with Dan Carker, who's the son of my publisher, but also an editor there and manages a lot of the book distribution. So if you order from a publisher, you would hear from Dan, or this publisher at Maine Authors Publishing. And I said, Dan, when I was coming up here, I always see those signs, to Marshall Point, and I haven't been there. And he said, oh yeah, that's the Forrest Gump Lighthouse. And I was a huge Forrest Gump fan. And on my way home that day in August, I stopped. These pictures are from a later visit. I've never been there when the roses are in bloom, the beach roses, but they are, because apparently the artist who works at Maine Authors Publishing and worked on the art for my book actually had her wedding photos at Marshall Point with the beach roses in bloom. So in that upper left, you would see beach roses in that field. That was the photo that my cover artist used actually to inspire her artwork, her painting. And she saw multiple points. And as you look at the photo, you can. The keeper's house to the right, I actually write about the, I always want to say renovation, the restoration, and it's not. It's the reproduction of the original barn. And when I first visited there that August, there was just a sign saying that they were going to do it. When I went back, and this is like January, December, it's right after Christmas, they had started it. It was up. So I love that picture. Marshall Point's been on the cover of Down East Magazine many times. I also like the one in the lower left because there's this, well, let me describe this a little bit. There's another 2-minute elevator speech that says, in my novel, The Main Point, Anna Malone, a screenwriter, decides to rent the second floor apartment of the keeper's house at Marshall Point with her boyfriend of 4 years, Jake Summers. Well, that little balcony over the door that you see is exactly what I'm describing. And I actually climbed out onto that balcony. When I visited the second time, my husband was with me, and the tenants were moving out. Doesn't happen very often. They stay long periods of time, and it very quickly rented again. But her name was Irene, coincidentally, or there are no coincidences, I guess. I truly believe at this point. She decided to let us in, and we got to see the view. And from that balcony, when you look out, you're looking at the lighthouse, Mohegan Island in the distance, Port Clyde, if you look right, the Atlantic Ocean, if you look left, if you look right again, St. George River, looking straight out, Hart Island. It is an incredibly romantic view. So that view inspires Anna Malone to write her first novel, which, of course, is historical fiction and is going to include a lot of the history of the lighthouses, the lighthouse service, the transition to the Coast Guard, the automizing of it all, and personal ownership. So remember that guy on the airplane? It turns out that he is restoring lighthouses in Maine and is the founder of Comey, Keepers of Maine, Inc. Fictional, but totally inspired by a real person. And I have done everything I can to camouflage who that real person is, including the only fictional name of a place in Maine. Pearl Island is where his lighthouse, his own personal lighthouse is. And we're going to find out in the novel a lot about the restoration of that lighthouse station, which had practically blown away, and he saved it. Speaking about lighthouses, a story within a story. Anna Malone, I won't give away what she names her novel, but it's a thread. And she does write a lot about Hendrick's Head, because what she discovers in her research is a legend about Walcott Marr. Fact is that Walcott Marr was born, married, and died in the keeper's house at Hendrick's Head, which is the Southport Island of Booth Bay. And so Walcott Marr and his wife, by legend, rescued. There's a legendary rescue connected to Walcott Marr that some people don't even believe. But here's how there are no coincidences and why it's great to write historical fiction. I was at the Belfast market, actually representing Maine Authors Publishing and selling books and Daughters of Longreach. And a woman came by and she said, "Oh, I think I would love this book," and started talking. And she said, "My great grandfather was the lightkeeper at Hendrick's Head." And I said, "Walcott Marr?" And she almost fell over. And we had a wonderful conversation. And she told me that the legend is true. At least her family says it is, and she believes it is. Anyway, it was a great day at the Belfast market. The second part of my past storyline takes us to Lenox Hill Hospital, another storied place. So how do I write my novels? Clearly, places inspire me. And I have to be there. I have to know the place. I have to experience it. I research it. Lenox Hill Hospital has kind of always been part of my story. Almost all the women in my family became nurses. And I was of a generation where they went to hospital nursing school programs. There wasn't a 4-year Bachelor of Science nursing degree at that time. And so one of my older cousins and a very dear and successful nurse went to the Lenox Hill Nursing School. And I had a picture in her graduation cap. And I chose this picture in the lower corner with it. If you're not from New York, you may not recognize the New York Yankee number 7, Mickey Mantle, but quite a hero. Now, this picture was taken in 1956. Okay, truth be told, complete transparency, that was the year I was born. So I was immediately attracted to this picture. And the nurses are wearing the distinctive Lenox Hill cap. And I spend a lot of time describing that cap because my cousin, if you know me, I'm short, but the men in the family and some of the females are tall, a lot of them. And Mary was almost 6 feet tall. So here's this tall, striking woman with this little, what I called a cupcake on top of her head. And I described it. And they're nursing students. And Stella Rose becomes a nursing student here. And you know that they don't have the black stripe. They don't even have the brown stripe, which they have at the beginning of their senior year. So they are young student nurses. Clearly, they're very excited to be surrounding Mickey Mantle. Just to mention the building, the German Hospital at the corner of Park Avenue and 77th Street. The German Hospital was actually established in 1855. Which is interesting because Daughters of Longreach begins in 1854. And in that book, one of my big sea captains winds up rushing his wife after they dock in New York Harbor to Bellevue, which has the oldest emergency room. Lenox Hospital here, German hospital, has a storied past. It was a German dispensary before it was moved to this corner in 1905. And by 1918, and perhaps it was for political reasons, it was renamed. But this was a German neighborhood, and many of the doctors and nurses did speak German in the late 1800s there. But as time went by, and we all know New York City has always been a melting pot, and I'm proud of the fact that I come from a place that is so diverse. There were many ethnic groups, and perhaps they felt that Lenox Hill, the name of the neighborhood, was a better name for it. So I don't know why, but it did change, and that was by the end of World War I. So I kind of like this picture. The Cherry Ames dates me, but I read it probably in its third edition. I have a couple of first editions now. I read them as a child, again, all the females being nurses. It seemed a great series. I loved it. I think I dreamt of being a nurse. I loved the idea of the blue cape. I grew up and found I didn't really love all the experiences of working in a hospital. So I chose to be a teacher instead. But I did read the Cherry Ames series, and it kind of helped me remember the whole nursing school story. And I love the fact that Student Nurse and Senior Nurse, the second book, were published in 1943. And that's when my Maine Point ends in 1943. People joke, well, how did the war turn out? Or, gee, what happened there? But if you read Daughters of Longreach, my prologue and my epilogue foreshadow, and we kind of know what happens, don't we? That brings me actually to the Alexandre Dumas quote I mentioned, the Count of Monte Cristo. All human wisdom is contained in these two words, wait and hope. So I finished the Maine Point in January 2020. It went to the publisher in February. One of the last things I did was to choose the quotes. And I wanted them because I was dedicating it to my mom and her sisters. And I always considered them to be inspirational. They survived. And I thought a quote was very appropriate. And the first one, we're going to see later, is from the Three Musketeers. It's the one everybody knows, but this one is a little less known. And it dates to 1844. We're talking 1845, actually, this one, 100 years prior to the end of World War II. And if 9/11 was the defining moment for many of my students, because I was teaching at that time, for my parents, obviously, World War II was their defining moment. And wait and hope just grabbed me. I did not know that the pandemic was going to hit the Northeast in March. And when I was due to release the book, I was scheduled to actually do it at the Patent Free Library in Bath in May to kick off spring into summer, and really to cut the ribbon on a year-long celebration for Maine's bicentennial, 200 years as a state. When all of the plans got canceled for May, I decided to, and on Facebook Live again for the second time in 2020, I decided to launch my book. I think it was March 16th or March 17th, but it was that 2-day period where Maine was going to begin to celebrate the bicentennial with bean suppers. And I'm very active with Main Street Baths. So we had all these bean suppers scheduled and lots of things. And I launched them because certainly this book and the present day storyline with the lighthouses and the Coast Guard and the Lighthouse Service really does celebrate Maine's history. The waiting and hoping was very timely, as it turned out. And at the same time that I launched and talked about my book, the Comfort, the USS Comfort, pulled into New York Harbor. And in my book, New York Harbor, yes. In my book, I write about the USS Solace. That was the only ship not fired upon at Pearl Harbor. And my dad is a Pearl Harbor survivor. That's a different thread of story, but yeah, the USS Solace looked a lot like the USS Comfort, and it really caught my breath when I saw those images on TV and the front page of the news. And I had remembered really researching and trying to get the description accurate. I mentioned it in the prologue in Daughters of Longreach, but I really focus on the role of the USS Solace and the medical personnel aboard. The Solace at Pearl Harbor came to the aid of the sailors that were in the water. after they had jumped from their burning ships. And the Wait and Hope speaks to those nurses who were in nursing school at Lenox Hill and graduating classes in 1940 and 41, 42, that most of the class would go into the Army and Navy Nurse Corps, which put a great stress on the big city hospitals and the country hospitals as well. A lot of what we're experiencing today of how stressed the support for the action is, in many ways, the pandemic feels like a war to all of us at this part. And the medical staff are on the front lines. And the present connects with the past. The reason to study the past, I believe then, and why I write historical fiction is because the lessons and the emotional stories we read prepare us for the real events. When you think about it, those of us who had young children were really kind of wondering, what was Disney thinking when he wrote Bambi? When you read the story that the mother is shot by the hunters and then little Bambi has to survive, what was he thinking? Well, I think we learn empathy through fiction, but I also think it prepares us for when that time comes, that we are challenged, that we have to have our moment of courage. No one knows they're a hero until they're in the situation. Perhaps fiction prepares us to do the right thing at the right moment, and builds the heroes that save us ultimately. I don't know the true answer to that. I only know how I feel about it. And that's why I like fiction, because you can express all those feelings through your characters, and hopefully people can gain strength from those characters and learn. There's the teacher in me. Everything that we are, we bring to our writing. And I suspect and I see that there are writers in the audience. And so you can't really separate yourself from what you've experienced in life. And when you are creating the fiction, people always say, well, is it semi-autobiographical? Is this you? Who are you in the story? And maybe you're in a lot of different characters. It's a blending. So this book that you see was a great source of research for me. And I'm writing fiction, but I'm doing lots of research to keep that history accurate. And I mentioned my ships are always accurate. When they were launched, when they were christened, who christened them, where they were built. The Northampton was actually built in Northampton, Massachusetts. And it was built in the 1930s, 1930 to be specific, and it sunk in 1942. So this book is huge, a big, heavy book. And my dad always referred to his years in the war as his college days. The Navy is his fraternity. The fact he was in his fraternity for 40 years is quite unusual and unheard of today, actually. But this is a little bit of him. And he did inspire Donovan, who comes in at the very end of the book. The war years is really a small part of the book. The part of the book is preparing for that in the past storyline. The picture is of a 17-year-old who enlisted in Brooklyn, New York, underage, but they weren't looking too hard at the time, in December of 1940. Exactly 1 year before Pearl Harbor, December of 1940. He had four older brothers and a younger sister. He didn't want to be left behind, just like my nurses, just like Stella Rose, who knows that war is coming and decides to go to nursing school. Many young people knew it was coming and wanted to be in a position to help. The matchbooks have a story unto themselves. They do not belong to my father. I know that my father was not a smoker. He told me so. And maybe I wouldn't have believed him, except he told this story, and I'm going to share it with you very, very quickly. When he was picked up by a destroyer, after the ship was, well, after they were ordered to abandon ship and the ship was burning, he was picked up and the sailor who hauled him in offered him a cigarette. And my father said, I don't smoke. And he said, throw this one back. He's dead already, because everybody smoked. So when I was selling books up in Unity at the Common Ground Fair, big event, there was a couple and they came up and they looked at Daughters of Longreach and my bio, and they said, we have two friends who survived Pearl Harbor, and brother and sister, and could you please personalize it? We're gonna give this to them. They were 10 and 13. Tom Gillette was 10 and his sister Diane, who they called Snooky, was 13. And their father was in charge of Battleship Row. So they lived right next door to Battleship Row and they saw the ships burn. The reason why I know the whole story is Tom Gillette received the book and then wrote to me, and he and his sister visited me in Bath when they came to visit their father's grave and their mother's grave. Their father, actually, he was their stepfather, became an admiral, Claude Gillette. He was a captain at the time. He was a classmate, and I believe from what Tom told me, he was roommates with Captain Kidd, who was the captain of the USS Arizona. He actually had just been made admiral because he was in charge of the whole group. And Snooky was invited on December 7th, 1941 to have dinner with the admiral and to see a movie. It was her birthday, and 2 weeks prior to December 7th, her brother had slept on the Arizona, watched a movie with the sailors, and had dined with Admiral Kidd. So Tom Gillette actually had that experience. Diane didn't. And of course, the captain of the Arizona, Admiral Kidd, died on December 7th. So Tom Gillette told me that he had matchbook covers back home in Houston, Texas, where they now live. He lives, his sister, I think, is in Mississippi. And he sent them to me. When he visited me, I showed him this picture and told him, you couldn't have my dad's matchbooks. He never smoked. And he said, looked at the picture and said, they all look like that. They all look just like that, which I thought was an interesting remembrance. I haven't been watching my time, and we're coming up on an hour, and I've almost completed this. I did not read the little section in the nursing school. My book's been out a few months, and lots of people have made lots of lovely comments and have been very encouraging and supportive. People talk more about the lighthouses and about the war chapters. Not as many comment about the nursing school experience. And I wanted to read a little bit from that part. And also to tie it in with why I felt the nurse's story was so important. I have one sentence in Daughters of Longreach that people quote, and sometimes they'll even ask me to write it in their book when I personalize it. And you see that on the right. Sorrow can burn you to bitterness or spin you to gold. I don't know when I first heard that. I know I paraphrased it. If you Google it, you won't find it. I think my grandmother or my mother said it to me once, and I interpreted it. But that sentiment has always stuck with me because, like you, every family has known great sorrow. Mine has certainly had its share. And I always go back to this and say, I want to be gold. I want to be golden. Sorrow can burn you to bitterness, and I do not want to be bitter. I want to be spun to gold. And many of the sea captain stories, specifically in Daughters of Longreach, there's the death of a young child, a 3-year-old near Calcutta in the China Sea. That actually happened to the sea captain and his wife who lived in my house. A blended name. It is not the Goss family, and the Gosses did live in my house. That little baby is actually born in that same cemetery as Admiral Gillette. And I know that that sea captain's wife also suffered a miscarriage on the return passage home. And they hit a very bad storm near New York Harbor. By the time they got into the harbor, she was rushed to Bellevue, and she did survive. But I have read a letter that describes that from that sea captain. So those stories, whether they be in the 1800s or the 1940s, or be in families today that have experienced COVID, that's the thread that also weaves history together. It's not just war, it's love. It's the love stories. It's you only grieve if you have really loved. And so really, history can also be told through the personal lens that is so loving and not so hateful and violent as the lens of war. Yes, we have to talk about the war, but we also need to talk about the love that sustained people, the love that allowed them to be spun to gold. This staircase is in my own home, that sea captain's house. His wife and he, their hands slid down it. My hand has slid down it. My family's hand has slid down it. So many people, the house is almost. In 2023, it will be 200 years. A lot of love, a lot of loss, and a lot of surviving. And that is the thread of both of my novels, love, loss, and survival. And I think that family love and home can help you survive. So the image of coming in the front door, whether it be Anna Malone after fighting her way through Hollywood and getting her movie, Captains of the Kennebec, as a feature film onto the screen, which at the end of Daughters of Longreach was a documentary, The Mariners of Longreach, and the movie people wanted to fictionalize it. I mean, it's a great entertainment storyline, I think, and it's entertaining, which is the purpose of historical fiction. So this staircase and this saying is very important to me. It also speaks to how nurses feel, at least I'm told. And I have a young son who's a young attending, and he did his fellowship at Columbia in New York City, and knows a lot about Mount Sinai and has a lot of good friends there. And if you saw the images, the nurses there were wearing plastic garbage bags when they were running out of protective wear. So I'd like to read a little bit about the nurse. It's my last reading, September 1939. So Penny goes to New York City in 37, and by 39, Stella is waking up. It's the first day of her second year of nursing school. Stella woke to the morning bell. With her eyes tightly closed, she pulled the crisp white sheet over her head. Her second year of nursing school was about to begin, and she silently wished for one more hour of sleep. But mornings at Lenox Hill were not for sleeping. It was the 5th of September, the day after Labor Day. 2 days ago, France and Britain had declared war on Germany. 4 days ago, Germany had invaded Poland. And 36 days ago, Stella had said goodbye once again to Maine, her mother, and her sweetheart, Ray. The world was plunging into chaos, but the hospital was waking up to another well-defined day. Regardless of the terrifying headlines and alarming radio reports, the hospital's clock kept ticking, and a nurse's duty remained unchanged. For 24 hours every day, the ambulances kept arriving. The gurneys kept rolling. Wheelchairs kept moving. Mothers in labor kept panting, and newborn babies kept opening their eyes. I'm sorry, that kind of grips me when my son was doing his fellowship at Columbia Hospital on the Upper West Side. He's a neonatologist. He works with the preemies. My first granddaughter was actually born in Columbia. And when you are in the labor and delivery room and you look out the window, you see where the towers used to be and where the memorial tower now stands. And I imagine the woman giving birth on 9/11 in that delivery room, and how that hospital kept doing what they do, helping people in need. So the connection between 9/11 and USS Comfort in New York Harbor, the USS Solace at Pearl Harbor, all of the nurses and doctors that we see trying to help us today connect us. How do we prepare ourselves to survive the worst of times? In a lot of different ways, but reading and education and talking about events are important. Now, I mentioned I was a Spanish teacher, so I taught a lot of 100 Years of Solitude and Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who always used to say, he did pass away not too long ago, but he said that all of history was a myth. It depends on who's telling the story. And as a Spanish teacher, I would say I agree with it depends on whose view we're seeing the story through. But I also think that there are some facts, irrefutable facts, that we cannot say, well, who told that story? And one of them is the Holocaust and what happened in Europe in the 1930s and 40s. And that is a major storyline for me. And a lot of it unfolds at Lenox Hill Hospital and what nurses did to try to help families trying to get their relatives out of Germany and Poland, their Jewish relatives. So that's a major storyline. I feel that events like the Holocaust and 9/11, the pandemic we're living through, that's history. Those are facts. That's not myth. And so when you write historical fiction, you have to be sensitive to that, to make sure that the big story is very accurate as you can make it. And yes, it does depend on who tells the story, what you emphasize and what you de-emphasize. But it is our responsibility to try to convey the emotional impact of sweeping world events on people so we can learn from them. Herman Wouk wrote, "The beginning of the end of war lies in remembrance." So I come from a military family. My father, my brother, my husband, so many served. And I think that will always permeate what I write. But I don't write just about war. I write about love, historical romance. And this quote on the copper beech tree that I actually took with my cell phone when I was taking a walk in 2018 up Washington Street. This tree is just a block away from my house. Is really that beautiful in the fall. I'm not a poet, but I could definitely feel the rhythm and rhyme of that extraordinary day. I think there are a lot of days that we feel are extraordinary. Sometimes that rhythm and rhyme is so soothing and calming, and sometimes it just makes us want to shake and shiver. But I feel that that's what historical fiction can do. It can give a sense of the rhythm and rhyme of extraordinary days. And sometimes I believe every day is extraordinary. I am not poetic, but I do think my storytelling has a rhythm. The Northampton slipping the tow line at 15:20, I use military time. This is a series of photos that was taken during the Battle of Santa Cruz. And that's the Hornet, a very large aircraft carrier that had just been torpedoed, and the smaller ship is the Northampton. This was a month before Tassafaranga. And this leads us to Thanksgiving and kind of a close here at 8:05. If you look at the date, this was the menu for November 26, 1942 aboard the USS Northampton. This would not have survived the sinking. Somebody sent it home. Somebody gave it to someone, but they were not underway. On November 26th, they were in port in Santo Espiritu. It's a group of islands, Hebrides. I'm probably saying the Hebrides wrong, Hebredes. That's where the Northampton was until November 30th, when they went out with a task force in pursuit of a convoy of Japanese vessels that were bringing reinforcements and supplies to Guadalcanal. And Guadalcanal was a battle that had been ongoing and very bloody. I'm always surprised by the right. They list the officers. Captain Kidd, like Billy the Kid, Captain Kidd was the admiral aboard the USS Arizona. Captain Kitts was the captain, the commanding officer for the Northampton when it was sunk. And he had only taken that spot several weeks before Thanksgiving, but they're all listed there. And then on the right, the menu, and I love seeing and my gallery view is closing it, but I love the dessert that they mention, the maple nut ice cream, and just that they had Tom turkey and Virginia ham, the iced lemonade, I remember. But on the bottom, this was 1942, cigarettes and cigars right after dessert. It's just, it is a capsule, a time capsule. It also says to you that you can't really judge history by present day standards. We now have so many no smoking rules and health, and they just considered it just the normal thing to do after dessert, I guess. The Battle of Tassafaranga lists all the ships, and there you see the Drayton. The USS Fletcher. Fletcher class destroyers were built in Bath. Bath built more destroyers than any other shipyard in the country during World War II. But the first one was not built in Bath, and that Fletcher was the original, the prototype. The Drayton was the one that picked up sailors from the Northampton, and surviving 500. Now, my dad was picked up by the Fletcher, not the Drayton, but both of those ships were there, part of the rescue mission. If you look at the heavy cruisers, all of them were damaged. Minneapolis, New Orleans, Pensacola, Northampton was sunk, and the Honolulu was the only one that escaped unscathed. But it was considered a successful mission because they stopped the convoy. And I like to include the little postcard, the Popeye type images from the front. Oh, says to her, sounds very much like Popeye. I love the card. It was in my dad's, what we do call the war book here. It's addressed to a Miss Estelle, the connections, no coincidences, to my Aunt Estelle. All my love, Bob, but you cannot judge the 1940s by the 2020 standard. He opens his postcard to his sweetheart, "Hi, chick." As a teacher of Spanish, I couldn't even say chica to someone and not be a little bit on the offensive side there. So it struck me, really struck me. I want to get to the close here. If there's any questions, I'm sure Chris is going to stop me. August 1945 is my other Alexandre Dumas from Three Musketeers. He wrote it in 1844, again, 100 years before. All for one and one for all. Well, there are certainly more than three musketeers here. My father is front and center. He is in the front row, in the middle. You can see his watch, his hands is on his knee. He's holding a glass, not a bottle. Would you believe it? My dad was a sailor and I never knew him to be a drinker. I don't know what was in that glass. I mean, it was 1945. These are the lucky ones. They had just arrived home to Tacoma, Washington. And although most of the men were from the Northeast in this group, Tacoma was close enough to call home. So the sweetness of home is never so great after being at war for 5 years, so far away. If you remember that first picture of my dad at 17, and here he is at 21, he matured a lot. He looks different. He looks different. He was in the Navy until 1981 because he was a machinist mate and he could always keep those old tin cans afloat, as he said. In his last years, he was clearly a reservist, but he was in those boiler rooms. I like to have this one at the end because the present day storyline, you're going to come across a sunrise farm. It really does exist in Harpswell. I drove by it, stopped, had to take a picture. Places inspired me, had to write it into my novel. It's actually called Sunset Farm, but I'm all about the sunrises, the new day. And this picture brings me to the conclusion. In 2018, that's me at real life, face to face, I'm at a Freethinkers Corner. It is early March, end of February. You can see March at the headline, and there's Daughters of Longreach. A happy day. And we're back. Hi, Chris. Oh, it's
Right.
8:10. I went long,
It's
sorry.
okay. It's all right. It was very, very interesting. I
Okay.
just want to throw my comment out there that, about the Daughters of Longreach. I haven't read the second one yet, but I did read the first one. That you talk about writing love into your stories. I definitely got that, especially with one particular scene where there was a death of a prominent character and the funeral for him, and how all the townsfolk came out for that funeral. You just feel the love of that the emotion written into the story about around that character and how beloved he was by the townfolk, and it still sticks with me. It's been what, a couple years since I've read it.
Yeah. Well, Chris, if the camera was in a different position, right over there, over my back door, I have a half hull model from the Goss, Sawyer and Packard shipyard from 1877 of the Jonathan Bourne, not Jason Bourne, Jonathan Bourne. And Guy Goss built that ship in the shipyard just behind the house and a little bit north. And that character was captain in the book, Henry Goss, but his real name was Guy Goss. And he did receive a hero's burial. And the interesting thing about connecting the dots and how really it is all about connection. He actually died in Staten Island, and he became the solicitor. He sold the Bath-built ships in New York Harbor at the South Street Seaport. And when you're standing on the Brooklyn Bridge, you can see the South Street Seaport, and you can that's exactly where he was. And I can remember one time flying into New York City from Portland, and we went a different way. It was in the morning, and I actually flew by the towers where they would have stood. And I flew by the Brooklyn Bridge and saw South Street Seaport. And then I saw the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And for me, it was like Anna's Landing. It was that landing home. And we landed at LaGuardia that day. So that particular Captain Guy Goss was voted into the legislature twice. None of his children survived. I might have mentioned to you one time, that's why I use his name. But one of the heroes that emerges in my story is his son, because in my story, I have one child survive. And yeah, so there was a mixing of characters, history there, but a lot of the events, people say, why did you have this sad event? And I'll say, well, that actually happened. So there is both joy and sorrow all the time. So I think a couple of people stayed all the way to the end. I really want to thank everyone. And
Yeah.
if anyone has any questions, I'm open for them.
Yep. Well, the other thing too that I enjoyed about Daughters of Longreach is at the time that I read it, I was researching my family history, and so the idea of the it starts off, with one of your main characters flying into back home to Maine, meeting up with her mother, who is part of an organization trying to save a cemetery from being
That's
ripped up.
right. That's right.
So that, and then the way you work the two stories of that, them trying to save the cemetery, finding out the history of the house that they live in, and also the backstory of those people, the captain and his family, and how eventually you brought them together. I really enjoy reading stories like that, to see both sides and how they fit. So it was very well written in that respect.
It is a twist. And I always say that I never actually read books on how to write. But my daughter-in-law gave me one book when I was reading Daughters of Longreach, and it was by Bird by Bird. I bet some of the authors know it, by Anne Lamott. And there was a sentence in there that just grabbed me. And she said, when you're writing a novel, it's like driving at night. You can only see as far as your headlights. And I cannot tell you how that is so true. I do not have an outline for my books. I start there are definitely some things I know I want to include, but I start coming along, and in the MAINE Point, there's a love story at the hospital. No, actually at National Screen Service that takes a lot of twists. And people are like, I never knew how you were going to resolve that. And you don't. But as you write it and you're very close to these characters and you feel like, how can I get them out of this tough situation and let them heal and be saved in some kind of way, almost like you're nursing them back to health. And then it comes to you like, oh, you're there. And now you can see the path, and then you get a little further. And I really feel that there's a lot of that. And so many people will say, I just don't know how you're going to connect this. And then boom, it connects. But isn't that what happens to us? That's like been my experience since coming to Maine, but even before, like finding out about the USS Drayton and things like that. It's just even the Lenox Hill, when I was researching it and finding the photo of Mickey Mantle, I found an amazing photo of Marilyn Monroe with her husband, Arthur Miller, also in 1956, coming out of Lenox Hill Hospital. She had suffered multiple miscarriages during her marriage to the playwright. And so she looks beautiful, but she's coming out of a very storied hospital. And Lenox Hill, John Lennon was brought there when he was shot. So you're writing these things and you're making all these connections, and you're almost relearning and rediscovering things that have happened. And those are little personal stories, even if they're famous people. Marilyn Monroe, Mickey Mantle had his tonsils out at Lenox Hill, but they're part of the history of that building. When I write about the Portland Press, well, the Press Hotel is in the Portland Press building in Portland. It's where they used to print and write the newspaper. And that's actually named the Gannett Building. I didn't know that was the Gannett Building. And I have major characters in Daughters of Longreach named Gannett. I was like, and I love the Press Hotel. And I love, they have the typewriters mounted on the window. I mean, it's a writer's delight to go into that hotel. And so much of that was just woven together. I felt like this connection to Gannett and the shipbuilders. So there is that aspect to it. And that's why I love historical fiction. It's just almost, it just seems to open up more than actually reading just the dry facts, just the facts, you know, like Joe Black, just the facts. Not so much for me. Yeah.
Well, a fellow Maine writer and a friend of the stores, Carrie Moser. She's watching today and listening. She says, "Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the family history aspect, and as an Army brat and Army wife, I totally relate to how being a part of a military family inspires fiction and how you explain looking for a touchstone, a place to call home. I also love the aspect of history told through war, typically, and how you emphasize love being an important aspect of historical fiction."
Thank you. Some people don't get it. If you say romance, some people step away, because I've been in that position to be at book fairs, and like I mentioned, the Common Ground Fair and up at the Lobster Fest, and I'll literally be at a booth talking about my book. And if I mention romance, people go, oh, I don't do romance. And lots of people say, I only read nonfiction. I just think there is so much to be learned or mined. It's almost like you're going mining for something. What can I learn from this? And I think there's a lot. And I do think that love makes history go down a little bit easier. It's kind of like the Mary Poppins, you know, it's just a little sugar on the medicine you have to take. And you do have to know your history. If you don't, and we all know it when we listen to pundits talk, and they're wrong with their history, everybody's calling them out on it, because there is an importance to getting the facts right as well. Easiest way to learn them is to add a little sugar to those facts in terms of remembering them. So I was one of those people who always taught with mnemonic devices. So this is sort of my way, adding love to the histories, or like, remember that story. So for sure. But I'm glad to see there's someone who appreciates historical romance. And you'll appreciate this. I married an Air Force guy, not a Navy guy. That's what it's like. And it's really something. Even my son will mention, it's like, how did that even happen in your family? It was like, oh, that was hard. I had to bring him home and say, oh, the uniform is not the same color as your uniform. And I'm sure lots of people out there can appreciate that, but that's the beauty of America. We're mixing it up. So yeah, it was, thank you, Gary, for understanding that, because it really was a big deal. It was a big deal.
Well, Kate says it's so inspirational, and she agrees. It makes sense about love making history a lot more memorable. So what was it that inspired you to write? We'll start with Daughters of Longreach. On your bio, on your website, there's a quote that said you fell under the spell of a historic home in Bath, and I'm assuming that that's the house that you live in now.
Yes.
And then all the history in that, when you started researching that, was it, and it's obviously the people and the events surrounding the people, but what was it more? Was it the people's story? Was it the Bath Iron Works? Was it the shipbuilding industry, or the time period? What was the most the thing that drew you to writing about that the most?
It is the connection to the sea. I always use that, seafaring. I would often say when I talk to people, they're the ocean people and the mountain people. But Maine is unique because you could actually stand in a point in Maine and you can see the mountains in New Hampshire and you can see the ocean. And so and I'm not a native of this area. Like I say, my husband grew up in New England, but and I knew the seacoast, Montauk Point and all, but it's definitely the sea that inspires me and the sea stories. And when I say that I come from a family of sailors, in every saying, there's a lot of truth. And there's a saying, the sailors tell great stories. And my dad was a storyteller. I was the first woman in my family to go to college. So I was also the first generation to go to college in my family. And my dad was a chief petty officer when he retired. He didn't go to college. He read lots of books. But I tell you, when he told a story, everybody listened. And it was just, I could listen to him tell stories rather than watch television. And he did love the movies. And we used to go to the movies all the time. And I don't apologize for watching movies, because I think you do learn empathy and experience. And even though you haven't traveled to all those places, you get a sense of it. And that was the sailor's life. My dad was used to going around the world. My brother, my brother tells sea stories too. He was the first American vessel on the Reuben James to dock at Vladivostok since 1945. And the Cold War hadn't even come to an end. And he tells stories about that docking in Vladivostok on a US ship. So I would listen to their stories. And having not been a sailor, although I have a photograph, I was doing a book sale in Georgetown, and they have one of those 1940s, I wish I were a man, I joined the Navy, and it's a girl wearing a sailor's cap. And I go, I think I felt like that sometimes. Oh, I wish I had those stories. And now today I have students who I wrote the recs for to go to Annapolis and West Point, and I hear from them all the time. And I had a student who went into the Foreign Service. She was actually killed in Afghanistan. And there are many women who are doing all those things. But I found coming to Bath to be so in touch with people who in the 1800s who started that. And the lighthouses do the same thing for me. They saved sailors. And so I love the stories of the lighthouse keepers as well. It's really, I guess it is in the blood. I guess it's a little bit of that wanderlust. They say, you come from that kind of stock, then you're always going to be keeping your eyes on the horizon. In fact, I didn't take it, but I'm going to really recommend it. Lois Lowry, who wrote The Giver, did a presentation for the Patent Free Library, and she has written, she's in her 80s now, a book called On the Horizon. Her father was in the service and he was assigned to Pearl Harbor, and she was 3 years old in 1940. And there's a film of her playing in their front yard. She also lived near Battleship Row, and the Arizona is in the background. So it made her, she was watching that film, she wrote a whole book of poetry about a group of men who died on the Arizona, officers and sailors, including Admiral Kidd. And I read the poem, and it's written really for children. I mean, sixth, seventh grade. I'm going to give it to my brother, who was a commander in the Navy. It moved me to tears, and it was in very simple language. But she, this great author, in her 80s, still felt the need to write about it. And when I read her little book about Hawaii and Pearl Harbor in that time, I just felt like she understood. And the interesting thing about it is, and this for Carrie, both my mom and dad, their lives were changed by the war. So my dad got a Dear John letter, and my mother lost the boy she was supposed to marry, and the neighborhood boy that was her love. So they didn't meet until they were older. They had to start over again after the war. And my mother was older by 10 years than most of my friends. And I today, I'm 64, many of my closest friends are 71 or 72. And I always wondered why I gravitated. And then I realized that our mothers were the same age. We were raised by women of that age. And somehow that, I think, altered my makeup a little, where I could bond almost better with people who were a little bit older than me. I don't know if there's any truth to that, but that's the emotional part of the impact. Lives are forever altered by world events, and those little stories have a trickle effect, and they're just keep on trickling, and they change that path quite a bit. So I really connected with Lois Lowry, and she signed both a copy of The Giver and On the Horizon for me. And wow. So if you get a chance, that would be a book to buy. Go to a Free Thinker's Corner and order that book. All right. That would be great.
How long did you do your research before you started writing either books?
3 years. It was a 3-year process for Daughters of Longreach. Really 2 years of research and 1 hard year of writing and some rewrite. The second one was faster, and mostly because it brought me into the 1940s, and I really knew the history very well. And I mean, I felt like I lived it secondhand, but I really knew a lot about it, and I knew where to go for it too. So that was really only, I'd say, 9 months of research and a year and a half of writing, because I did a lot of rewriting. It's longer. It's 310 pages, where Daughters is 215. And that's the thing for the writers. I don't know if you find it to be true. I think shorter books are more popular these days. I don't want to say that the tomes are not. I mean, I just read Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkinson, a 500-page book. But I think the typical reader, they're busy and they want to do books pretty fast. And so I think that if you get too many pages in there, it's almost a deterrent. And it's interesting. So I tried to pare back a little bit. I definitely could have had more. But for those of you who do series, mine is not a series. I never really intended, after Daughters of Longreach, to do a sequel. From Anne Lamott, another statement of the only book that I ever read about writing, she always said, oh, leave them wanting more. It's a good way to leave, and let them feel what might happen. And I got so many responses like, I have to know. I mean, I can't believe you ended it there. Things like that, even with the second one, because I ended it in 43. And I said, well, just go read Daughters of Longreach and you'll figure it out, because it's a little bit like How I Met Your Father instead of How I Met Your Mother. So I think that the sequel came really from reader demand. They were like, we'd like to know more. And I really was trying to shy away from a lot of my own family story. And I knew if I got into the World War II years, I was going to get more into that. I still like keeping that, emotional distance. Blended characters is the way to go. People sometimes ask, which one are you? I'm not a Rose. I was Ellie in Daughters of Longreach. So if people read both and they go, what about Ellie? Well, she's still there, but she was never intended to be the story. The story is really my mother and my daughter. And it's blended characters, of course. But yeah, Stella and Anna are key. And Mary Rose is kind of a dream. Yeah, a dream.
What was the most interesting thing that you found during your research?
That the USS Drayton having my dad talked so much. I mean, he was 18 years old when that ship sunk, and I'm not including all of the horror. The biggest horror for Navy injuries is the burns, which I do write about in the main point, but not to the extent. And so I think that knowing that 1936, I just said, oh, I want to include that they launched this ship. This was hope. And I don't know if I mentioned, but 1936 was the year Maine put vacation land, right, on the license plate. They were trying to be optimistic. And I do think that is the greatest strength of America, is that we've always been optimistic. And that's not true of other places in the world. So I think that when I found out that the Drayton then was there to help my dad's shipmates, the Fletcher couldn't pick up all of them. They were pretty scattered. I think that was just like, wow, I just couldn't believe that. So that was the most intriguing part. I also really loved talking to my cousins and revisiting the nursing school experience and the value of nurses and what they were able to do for the servicemen. Even going back to that Sherry Ames series, I was always enthralled with how strong they were. And it's funny, new series today like Outlander, not a surprise that the key character was a military nurse who then goes back in time, but they were incredibly strong. And I really feel like they're heroes and maybe unsung. The Nurses of Bataan, I mean, unbelievable stories from some of those nurses. Yeah.
You had a couple quotes there from Alexander Dumas. This is one thing that I've always wondered, because I read a lot of books, and obviously I do a lot of audiobooks now with the store, because I just, with all the time that I don't have, it's easy to do audiobook. But there's still, I've read a lot where there are quotes from other writers and stuff at the beginning of a chapter or the beginning of a book or a dedication or something. How did you choose those quotes? How do writers, is it just something you remember that pops into your head from something you read in the past, or do you go out searching for certain quotes that fit your...
Another author mentioned this. I was doing a Zoom and they quoted a part of my book back to me. And I was dumbfounded, because in a million years, I remember I'm the one who said, I'm not a poet. My prose is really prose. And some people say, you speak very clearly, crystal clear. And that's the teacher in me. So I think a writer is more sensitive to that sentence that strikes them, where they just remember it. I heard a writer describe historical fiction in different words, but there's a big story and a little story, and it stays with me. I'm like, that's true. All historical fiction has the big story and the little story, and it will resonate. So I think that they just, yeah, I kind of know them, and I have a sense that it's there. And sometimes I'll even take out a book and look again. And that's how it was for The Count of Monte Cristo. Whereas everyone knows the all for one, one for all. It's been in the movies so much even. The Count of Monte Cristo, Alexander Dumas had that sensitivity. And I have to say, I'm that Spanish teacher that always quotes Don Quixote. And Don Quixote had some sayings that, for instance, I can still to this day No man should be enslaved who God has made free. I mean, Quixote said that in the 17th century. Well, really, it was Miguel de Cervantes. God made man. No, nobody has the right to enslave God's creation, which was the free creation. He spoke with such sincerity, such sensitivity. And so there are things written in 1605 when I read them in Spanish that I will translate in my mind. Ana Maria Matute said, everything changes and everything remains the same. And I thought that was her statement. I think that's from Shakespeare, but just written in fancy English, that Ana Maria Matute, who was a scholar, she's a writer. And I think many of the speeches you hear politicians say, I'll go, that was in Don Quixote, I'm sure of it. And do you all remember the movie series that was on Newsroom? And that Newsroom was an allegory. And my students, who I was always quoting Quixote, were writing and say, you have to see this series. It's based on Quixote. And I looked at it and I had missed the first, segment. What are they talking about? When I watched the whole thing, he actually does make the Quixote comparison, that he wanted to right all the wrongs. And some of us military family people especially, I think when we write and we realize what our families have sacrificed to, let me describe what makes me write this type of thing. My mother certainly inspired my writing. If I get personal, the prologue of Daughters of Longreach reveals that. My mother did die of lupus. Perhaps the greatest tragedy was my brother was on an aircraft carrier in the Indian Ocean. My brother hadn't seen my mom in probably 2 years. And this was before Google Duo and FaceTime and everything else. And my brother, who, is an Iron Man, literally, Hercules, my mother adored. She would salute his picture. My mother was dying and the doctor said, get your family together. I said, my brother's in the Navy. He's on an aircraft carrier. He was like, call the Red Cross, because that's how you had to do it. And I went to a payphone and I called the Red Cross and they said, you got to get the doctor. And I think I actually ran and got the doctor. The doctor had to verify that it was a death situation. We were not at war. My brother was lifted off the aircraft carrier by a helicopter, I think. He said the liftoff. And he said it was the most dangerous liftoff he had ever had. He went around the world. He missed my mother by a half hour. That's the sacrifice of the military family, and that's not even in war. So I like to write about the hero that gets the happy ending. I think we all know that there's not always happy endings, but even when I watch movies, I want to root for the good guy. So my books are never going to have as much of the dark side. That sells a lot of books, quite honestly. And everybody who reads my book, they know, well, this isn't going to happen in Irene's book. This isn't going to happen. And they're right, because I have a different purpose. I write completely for hope. And I believe you have to be an optimist to survive. And that's what my family has taught me. And so the wait and hope quote, that was meant to be. And I didn't know it until I was done writing the book. That's in my front pages. That wait and hope, it was as if that's why I wrote the book, and I didn't know it until it was done. As my illustrator says, my cover artist, there are forces that move us. And sometimes I feel I'm moved to write.
You ever think of having your...
Wow.
Yeah. Did you ever think of having your books translated into Spanish or even Russian?
Oh, I would love the Spanish, because that's another thing. No one talks about my Penelope, and I put the accent. I did have one one person questioned, why are you putting that accent? And I said, well, it's like Penelope Cruz. It's not Penelope. So I remember out in the White Sox when I was teaching in Chicago when Maglio Ordonez got the tilde over his name. They had a poster I put in my classroom. Oh, my Latino students were like, there's the tilde on Ordonez. They were so excited. So I really wanted to have a little of that Spanish flavor. And I love the way I get Dan Leone knows some Spanish, and Sal Leone knows it from his neighborhood, because in New York, you have so many languages around you. Russian is a harder sell because of the Cyrillic alphabet, and I don't know who I would get to do that. I think that would be, I know that my textbooks when I was young, learning Russian, they had stick figure drawings. They were coming out of the Soviet Union. It was practically contraband. I don't know how I got them into the school got them, but my textbooks looked like contraband. They were ridiculous. And there was no English. They were just Russian. The instructor, you had to really work at it, believe me. So it was not an easy thing to acquire Russian. But Spanish, that I would love to see. I would love to see that. Yeah, that would be fun.
With a little time we have left, I'd like to talk about the technical aspects of the writing and the publishings of the book. You mentioned that you had both books published through MAINE Publishing Group.
MAINE Authors Publishing.
MAINE Authors Publishing, right?
I love them. They're great.
Good. What made you decide to go a traditional route instead of self-publishing?
Well, MAINE Authors Publishing is a small press, but it's in Maine, and it's a cooperative, which I love. Writing doesn't have to be lonely, and I think I've really found a community in MAINE Authors Publishing. In fact, I'm going to do a little class with them on Friday, a little Zoom, and help out some new authors. I also wanted to keep the publishing in Maine. Maine inspired my writing at that time. And actually, I started working on my third book. And because I've made so many trips to Thomaston, that's really how Marshall Point came in. And I love St. George and Port Clyde and really discovered that area. I've done Zooms with the Cushing Library and the Olson Farm. And now I'm really interested in some of the history of Thomaston. And so they were just, it was almost organic. There's no coincidences. But I stumbled upon MAINE Authors Publishing on the 4th of July. The first year I moved to Maine, I had run this little 5-miler and was walking through the park, and they were having a fair, and they had a tent and a booth, and their sales rep was there. And I said, oh, I'm writing a novel. I just retired. I'm going to write a novel. And they were like, well, send it to us. And I did. And I have not regretted that decision. It's been really a good experience for me. They're very genuine. And I have to, though, and I'm not doing this as a plug, I think the indie bookstores, Daughters of Longreach came out at a time where I think bookstores were having a little renaissance. Mm-hmm. And I was lucky enough to be there. And now it's kind of a tough time, but I truly believe that the indie bookstores are providing something for the community, and almost it's like emergency relief to have the bookstores providing reading. I think talking about books and getting good books, I mean, as a teacher, I know that's so important. Remember that book, The Book Thief? I mean, I read that, and not until someone takes your books away from you do you realize how much you need them. And you control minds if you control what people read. So I love a Free Thinker's Corner. That is a good name for a bookstore, because
Thank you.
You have to be free. La libertad. If you get to the end of the main point, if you read the book, the last line, I almost had an argument with an editor, and they wanted me to write more. And I was like, no, this must be the last line of this book. This must be the last line. And I am very wedded to that line. So that's a good reason to get the main point. You have to read the last line.
Yeah. Well, it's like one of the other books we have, another Maine writer. Hers is more a sort of a supernatural thriller. But there's one line, the last line in chapter 2 it just shivers. And
Yeah.
that's how I described it on the post. I'm reading so and so's book, and last line in chapter 2, and I just wrote shivers. I won't say what it is because I want you to experience that, but it was just as what a way to end a chapter.
But every author works so hard to have that line. It's like, and there are authors that, I mean, it's like poetry and prose, there's no doubt. But there are other storytellers that you gotta look for them, but they come too, because that's the force that moves you. If you're writing a book and you really feel that connection to the characters in that story and you've got to get it out, then there will be more than one line. They're there. And those lines are worth writing and worth remembering. I truly believe that. I do.
That's why I mentioned with that the funeral scene. It just the characters, you were able to write so much emotion into just the description of the funeral itself and the emotions that the characters and the townspeople had without actually them saying anything. It was emotional. I did. I could just feel everything that was
I
going on.
remember you telling me that. I do. And there was music in that
Yeah.
funeral. There was and I do in both. I never mentioned this, but in both books, I reached out to families. Hoagie Carmichael for Old Buttermilk Sky in Daughters of Longreach, and The Sinking of the Reuben James for the MAINE Point. And oh my gosh, of course, Woody Guthrie, right? So I could not contact. I was reaching out for Woody Guthrie, and I finally called up this publishing company, this company in New York. Guthrie said something, and it was Anna Marconi, who was Woody Guthrie's granddaughter. And she helped me get in touch with all the people to get permission to use some lyrics from The Sinking of the Reuben James. And it was worth it to me because the music is important. So yeah, I see that that sometimes it takes a little of that. And that funeral scene, that was very accurate, that the flags were at half mast, that all the shipyards closed, that all the biggest people in the community, the owners of the largest, carried his coffin. A lot of that was accurate. And then there were just nuances of who was there and what they meant to each other. It's interesting. I don't want to be political, but there was a speech, what music, you just say the song and someone connects, but On Eagle's Wings, and I will lift you up on eagle's wings. Well, they played that at my mother's funeral. When I hear someone say the name of that song, On Eagle's Wings, they have me right there. I mean, I've just connected. I know what they're talking about. And that's how I used a very old song in that funeral that I didn't even have to have rights to. It was so old. And it just is one of those, the lyrics just touch people sometimes. So that's kind of how that creative part works, I guess. That's literature. That's why we're in the book business, really.
Right.
It's to share that. It's a sharing. It's definitely a sharing.
Kind of want to step back just for a minute. Kate has a question. What interested you? What got you interested in studying Russian, and what age did you start, and how were you able to?
Oh, easy. I was recruited, but before I was recruited, remember I said I was first woman in my family to go to college. I also was the designated hitter of my family to become a doctor. I had apparently wonderful abilities to take tests and do well, and I was a very, very good science and math student. And so I went to the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts to become a doctor. And Dr. Fauci is a graduate of the College of the Holy Cross. It is a very fine institution for pre-med, let me tell you. And I was biology pre-med, and I had, unfortunately, well, because my mom had been so sick, I had spent a good deal of time understanding hospitals, and I was moved and I wanted to, but there was something in my heart that wanted to run away from hospitals too, and the sadness that sometimes happens there. And so it was a conflict. And even though I tried to make myself want to be that doctor, I wanted to save people, I also wanted to run away from the sorrow, right? So I was very good at languages, and I knew if I told my dad I was going to drop out of the pre-med program, he would yank me out of college and bring me home and I would get a job. So I decided to tell him that I could learn Russian. I already knew Spanish and be a double major, and I was sure I could get a job. And I had a professor who recommended I go to Middlebury, and I was at Middlebury because I had to catch up. I hadn't studied any Russian, and I had 1 year of college down. So I did an intensive Russian program at Middlebury. And while I was there, I was recruited by the government, and I had a lot of aptitude. And they sent me actually to Harvard to take this day-long marathon test in everything: architecture, art, language aptitude. You even had like an hour to study an imaginary language, and then you took a test in it. Everything, math, everything. And sure enough, I qualified. And the only cachet was I had to major, had a double major. Couldn't be a minor, double. I had a very heavy load. I did not have a lot of fun. I studied a lot. And I went right into the intelligence community right out of college. It just was, they needed people. And I came from a military family. And just Kate, I actually know Kate. I don't want to bore you with this, but I had to have a lot of testing, like lie detector, blood test, psychological evaluation, and they flew me down to a certain base. And when they got done with all the testing, they were like, "Where are you from? And are there more of you?" Because I was like, I hadn't done anything but studied. And I mean, my dad was a chief. I was like very well behaved or else. And yeah, it was just the right time. And I was able to help in the Cold War. That was how that went. So we won that one, by the way.
Yeah,
The Soviet Union fell and Kremlin is rising. So watch out. Yeah.
So in the few minutes that we have left, just a couple fun questions that I like to ask. Are your books, you don't have your books in audiobook format, do you?
No, and that is something, do you know, I was at your shop and a young man who was blind felt the cover of my book, and it has that sticker from the Next Generation Indie Award. And he was like, "What's this?" And I said, "Well, it's a sticker. I won this award." And I talked to him and he said, "Is it an audiobook?" And that's a moment where I wished I had a magic wand and could give him an audiobook. With Maine Authors Publishing, they don't have that component, so I would have to look for it. But you're not the first person who's asked, and that is something I would like to investigate, because especially for those who are legally blind, and for those actually, because Aunt Estelle actually became legally blind and used to listen to books. So I would really like that for people who are traveling long distance. People aren't traveling as much, but when we can, yeah, I would love that. If you know anything about that, get in touch with me.
I do, and I'll let you know right now.
All right.
We partner with a company called Libro.fm, and they help indie bookstores buy some of the proceeds from that sale of that audiobook or membership come back to us. So if you go to Libro.fm, just scroll down. Yep, just scroll down, or if you want, go on our website and click our link over to them. Scroll down. There is, you have to go all the way down. You might have to go all the way down to the bottom, but there is a page for authors, and go to that page, and it explains how to do it.
I'm very interested in that. And really, both, I do know a lot of people travel and use it, but also for people who are vision impaired. I really, in both ways. First, it's the vision impaired, but I do see there a great need for that. And yeah, that's something I'm going to look into for sure.
So here's the fun part of the question. If you were to have your book put in audio, let's just take, well, either one. What famous actor, actress, either movie, TV, voice actress or actor, would you like to have portray or speak for your main characters?
That's really funny because I kind of did that a little bit. I have a scene in the main point where Anna goes back for the premiere of Captains of the Kennebec and her whole family goes with her. It's sort of like a reunion of the Daughters of Longreach because Anna's two brothers are there and her mom and dad, and of course Jake Summers is there. So, and I had Jessica Lange play really the Mary Rose, no, the Celia Lincoln character. Um, I also, in terms of the guys, it was really funny in Daughters of Longreach when she was doing another screen, if you remember, she was doing Daisy Longtree, was her script that she was working on. And I had Mark Ruffalo be one of the characters. I don't know. I've always just kind of liked the way he delivers lines. So I don't know if I would have him for one of the male characters or not. But Jessica Lange came to mind in terms of, I have a lot of characters. So that's a tough one. I mean, favorites, Amy Adams comes to mind that I wouldn't mind at all. Certainly Katrina Balfour from Outlander. I'm a big fan. So there's a bunch. There's a bunch. Yeah.
Would you be up for reading it yourself? I mean, the way you read the parts that you read today, if they said, okay, would you like to be the narrator for your audiobook? Would you do
You
it?
know, Chris, you are very insightful. That's interesting you say that. I'm one of those authors who rarely does a reading. I just felt you had a program in mind and you had an hour and a half mapped out and you never know. This is actually the first time I used that PowerPoint. A lot of the Zooms have just been conversational and so it wasn't really necessary. And I thought, oh, it would be nice to have something that gives it that body. So you never know how long it's going to take. And I just thought that maybe only looking at the images, because we're so used to screen time, that the reading might be helpful to break up just looking at the images. I do feel visuals are very important in teaching, but there's something about that human voice. And the three sections that I read, I thought went with the images, but usually I really shy away from it. And it's interesting that you're going to have this as a recording. And I said to my husband, oh, I wish they weren't recording because I will not look at it again. I'm like, oh my goodness. I just have a hard time listening to myself. And so that's kind of interesting to say that. No, I can think of a lot of, my daughter is an opera singer. And oh, I would love for her to do Anna. That would be wonderful. She will not do it, but that would be wonderful. So yeah, but there are a lot of Jessica Lange, Amy Adams comes to mind. There's so many wonderful, wonderful voices, but not that they're going to be jumping up and down to read my novels out loud, but
Oh, you
I
never
can,
know.
you
You never
never
know.
know.
You
That's
never
right.
know. So final question. What who are your favorite authors and what are you reading now?
Oh, I am reading Monica Wood, One Boy in a Million. I'm in a book club and it's One Boy in a Million. She is a Maine writer, lives in Portland. My favorite writer in the world is Sue Monk Kidd, Secret Life of Bees. Um, I also really liked The Invention of Wings by her. I also like, oh gosh, now they're all. I just read a book for the first time, and I've discovered Paulette Giles, News of the World, and they're making a movie. Tom Hanks is going to play the lead character. We've come full circle, like Forrest Gump. So Paulette Giles, really, she's right on the top. And I like a lot of old books, like A Tree Grows in Brooklyn and Sand Pebbles and things like that. But of the contemporary, I also like Lily King, Euphoria. I really like Lily King. Another, well, she writes in Massachusetts and now lives in Maine. So I like her a lot too. But Sue Monk Kidd, Lily King. I like Elizabeth Strout. I have to read her. I can't write like her, but I read Olive and Olive Again. And I think that she is a great storyteller. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, she left the the event, but definitely Carrie Moser is somebody you should
I haven't
check
read and
out
I'm
as
going
well.
to, yeah. And
Yeah.
Kate Hotchkiss has joined us. She's a Maine author as well, Maine Authors Publishing. So
Great.
there's a lot of books
No,
I've yet to read.
there's so many books, so many great writers, so little time to read them, but
I know
so much space and very little money at this point.
but books are patient. Books are
They are.
patient. They will
Yes, they
wait
are.
for us. They will wait. Don't throw them out. They'll wait for us. Yeah.
Right.
Keep them on the shelf.
Well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure speaking with you, and we look forward to having you back in the store in person.
I would love
Daughters,
I would love
Daughters of Longreach and Main Point, both available in our store. Come in or through our website, freethinkerscorner.com. And again, we thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you.
Chris, thank you. I think this is a wonderful thing you're doing. This is actually community service right here. You are helping the whole community by doing this, our literary community as well. So I applaud this effort. I thank you for the opportunity, and I hope everyone stays healthy and has a happy Thanksgiving, and be optimistic and be hopeful. Wait and hope. That's what we
We
have to
will.
do. All right. Take care.
All right.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much. I appreciate it. Thank you.